In a world where the evolution of society is in the jaws of climate change, more and more people are in danger of climatic events. One of the most important environmental issues today is climate change. Ever since the industrial age began 150 years ago, factories, cities, farms, automobiles, and homes have been pouring carbon dioxide and other waste gases into our atmosphere. Scientists know that these gases contribute to what is known as the greenhouse effect. That is, like the glass in a greenhouse, these gases, along with water vapor and cloud cover, reflect infrared heat back to the Earth and lead to a warming of the Earth's surface. With the temperature continually rising, one nation most at risk is the Philippines. The Philippines is composed of many different groups of people, including women, children, indigenous, and poor. These different vulnerable populations all have different reactions and adaptations to climatic events that change the way they live. Although the Filipino government has taken steps to reduce the effects of climate change on its citizens, it is important to understand the history of climatic events in the country and the threats that will affect the country in the future. As the world becomes more and more globally connected, the effects of climate change will become important to international conversations of mitigation efforts to showcase specific vulnerabilities and opportunities countries have to continually develop and inform their citizens about what the world could look like in the next 50 years.
There are many impacts climate change have on the Philippines. The following vulnerabilities are such impacts. First is the geographics of the Philippines as a nation. Because it is comprised of 7,000 individual islands, the rising of sea levels as a result of glacial melts and the increase in ocean temperature leads to coastal infrastructure damage and cultural problems related to the relocation of indigenous people from the shoreline. Through aerial mapping done by the Philippines coastal sector, it has shown that the Philippines is susceptible to rising sea levels and flooding. Secondly, is the living conditions of large populations that live on the coast. The displacement of the affected villages exposes the vulnerability to the indigenous people. The problem is the large gap between social classes, which is the difference in villages and their stability. When the houses are destroyed by a flood, people in the Philippines need more money to rebuild the villages. Third vulnerability is the water quality of the Philippines due to climate change because of the imbalance of rainfall, resulting in uneven water distribution. Flooding would lead to saltinization of farms, hurting their crop yield and spreading waterborne diseases easily. The social differences in regards to socio-economic status would lead to challenges to access clean water. The flooding and droughts would put more pressure on the Philippines government because of economic needs. Since they will sustain serious damage to their water resources, they will require large funds to fix contaminated water. The fourth vulnerability is agriculture. Because agriculture is one of the most climate-sensitive sectors, the increased temperature in the Philippines would result in droughts on farmland, change in water temperature resulting in less fish for farming, breaking the food supply chain, and an increasing sea level which would result in floods destroying the farmland for crop yields. Climate change will break the ecological system of the environment, and the agriculture food supply chain will be unstable. Economics will also be negatively impacted because 20% of the Philippines' GDP is more on the side of agriculture, according to the Philippines economic sector. The final vulnerability is the public health. In urban areas, there is poor air quality, threatening human health. The increases in temperature, sea level, and disease all bring concerns to human health. Farms, fishermen, and poor households are most vulnerable to risk of climate change as their marginal income provides little or no access to health services or other safety nets to protect against the threats posed and changing conditions. The impoverished communities must seek out help from the government since they are more susceptible to these health issues.
Although these vulnerabilities bring negative impacts on the Philippines, they also present many opportunities as well. First of all, the first opportunity is the time sensitive of the Philippines. The ecological change of rising sea level and urbanization created the vulnerability seen in the country. However, because the Philippines is currently dealing with these adverse effects, they do not necessarily have time to prepare for the future impacts of climate change. The government must act fast on this climate change problem to fix the issue at hand, while also focusing more on trading off the balance with modernization. The negative impact will bring attention on the issue of climate change and get everyone on the same page to fight back against it. Secondly, mangrove reforestation of their coastal habitat will create healthier coastal areas and will produce more clean drinking water and a better land used for agriculture and living conditions. The opportunity of reforestation would bring the installation of more environmental refuge. Ecologically, restoration of habitat means better agriculture and fisheries to trade and boost the money flow. Culturally, a better habitat means better living condition and drinking water resource. Third opportunity is education for each social class in Philippines. As the sea level rise and the vulnerability cause ecological challenge, the government would not have enough money to support education costs. Therefore, education becomes necessary because more knowledge supports new innovation to build a more integrated system on agriculture, architecture styles, and water resource. Social communication can help this country to have more new technology because of higher attention on education. The fourth opportunity is specifically the new innovations. The Philippines get nearly 20 typhoons per year because of the ecological impact. The NOAH project will allow citizens to become more prepared for weather disasters by taking shelters. This will reduce strains on the health system and economic as well. With new technology like NOAH, there is a culture shock where Filipinos can be assured they will be okay during inclement weather and avoid losing loved ones. The final opportunity is the change of political structure. The government is compensating more for Filipino population and making the changes necessary to help them during climate change. The more government involvement and change to adapt to and mitigate climate change, the faster Filipinos can reduce their vulnerabilities. The increased government involvement will include the different socio-economic class by allocating their budget differently.
It is pretty obvious at this point that fossil fuel burning is the main cause of climate change, not only in just the Philippines but throughout the world as well. Specifically to the Philippines, fossil fuel burning did not become prevalent until the demand for more crop yield exports due to an increase in global population became an issue in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Since the population was rising, there needed to be more crops being shipped throughout the globe. High exports on integrated circuits and computers also increased the shipping fossil fuels, adding to the problem of CO2 levels. With approximately $71.2 billion per year being spent on trade, it is more than just an agricultural issue. Drilling of petroleum in the Philippines started in 1896 and grew to a widespread distribution in the late 1950s. During this time, the Oil Exploration and Development Act of 1972 allowed offshore drilling, which added to the fossil fuel burning problem. Eventually, the Philippines shifted toward using coal as 27% of their energy resource in 2005. It was used for energy, cement, paper production, and more, according to the Republic of the Philippines Department of Energy. American University stated the fact that for the past 50 years, the Philippines has lost 2.4 acres of hardwood forest every minute, leaving only a 21% forest cover. In 1989, the government imposed a lumber export ban in an effort to save the country's forests from uncontrolled illegal logging. The ban was later lifted in 1990, then reinstated after much criticism. The Asian Development Bank policy for the Philippines, a forest-poor country, focused on creating more domestic wood supplies through plantations in improving forest management practices. This policy looks to research and use alternative energies such as kerosene and solar power for the future. These changes will decrease deforestation and fossil fuel usage.
Thus far in the fight against climate change, multiple nations have attempted to work together in finding a solution to these effects we have already discussed. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, was founded in 1992 to begin the process of mitigation and adaptation to these adverse effects of climate change. The Philippines have had quite a role in the UNFCCC over the years and have proven their environmental concerns and willingness to address them through this involvement. The Philippines Climate Change Commission's mission is to focus on adaptation and mitigation to reach a nation with more resilience in the environment, while also aiding the communities to develop better safety and prosperity. This government involvement is what the country needs to reach decisions and change. The Philippines joined the UNFCCC in August of 1994 and wanted to focus on adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, ultimately resulting in sustainability among nations. The Philippines was involved in the third convention of parties in Kyoto, Japan. They agreed with the decisions made in the Kyoto Protocol to enact the Clean Air Act and the Solid Waste Management Act of 2000. The largest part of climate change for the Philippines is the aspect of reforestation. Under the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, of the Kyoto Protocol, the Philippines created the Land Use Change and Forestry, or LUCF, where they focused on reforestation in the Philippines. Their main goal was to change very little of the lives of the Filipinos, but also begin to change the environment back to the way it had been before all the deforestation. The main reason for deforestation in the Philippines was as a result of relocating families because of the flooding from original climate change effects. So this project was beneficial because of the research they were able to conduct, enabled them to focus on both rehabilitation of forests as well as the Filipinos. In the COP18 in Qatar, the Philippines engaged in RED, or reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. This is very similar to the LUCF, but instead it worked at the international level in addition to the national level. Internationally, the Southeastern Asian countries agreed to coordinate better on arrangements made in the agreement. On the national level, the Philippines needed to prepare for cooperation among different groups in the country. To address the renewable energy implementation, the Philippines have already begun to utilize these sources of energy, but are not at a self-sustaining level just yet. According to the Philippines Forest Carbon Budgets, the Philippine National Oil Company has a geothermal power plant on the island of Leyte. The Environmental Forestry Program monitors the potential carbon sequestration in the Philippine forests, hopefully reaching insight on the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that are offset. Overall, the Philippines is very environmentally friendly and solely needs the help of other powerful nations to continue making a change.
Throughout the past 13 weeks, Team JAWS has worked to create a sustainable platform and a recommendation consistent with Filipino politics in the past and present to ensure future success of the rapidly developing nation. Being one of the most at-risk areas from the impact of climate change, there have been many setbacks in the past with the destruction and the displacement of homes and families due to receding coastal lines. Controversy of overpopulation and expansion and trade-offs between different policies, both within the Philippines and the UNFCCC. There are issues that are prevalent today and will remain an important part of Filipino development in the future.
To fix the environmental issues with the Philippines, short-term fixes must be implemented, such as levees, to stop the rising sea level due to climate change and glacial melt. These short-term fixes will allow our indigenous people and vulnerable populations to reestablish themselves not only economically through agriculture, crop yields, but culturally, and will allow their health to get better. In the long run, more money flow will be going through the vulnerable populations, in which the government could then tax not only them, but the higher, richer populations as well, creating a renewable energy fund in which we can donate to a global fund working with other countries to make more renewable energies. Doing so, it will lower sea levels and save the Philippines as we know it.
One area we believe will be vital to the future development of the Philippines is renewable energy. Renewable energy is a major opportunity for the Philippines to work with other countries not only to combine funds, but to create a panel of scientists to find a solution to climate change that does not involve geoengineering. There have been terrible consequences to the Filipino nation due to geoengineering that hurts the people, economy, and overall geographic areas, such as the typhoon Yolanda in November of 2013, which caused a microwave pulse claiming the lives of thousands.
After Typhoon Yolanda hit us, we had nothing left. Our house was submerged and we received more rainfall in 1 week than we would in an entire month. The only thing that we could possibly do next is care for our children. The children is going to be the most vital and important asset to creating a sustainable future for climate change.
While this recommendation does not guarantee that major climatic events such as Typhoon Yolanda will not happen, it will create a better life for the Filipino people. Indigenous people will have the opportunity to stay on their land. Poor people living in coastal areas will see efforts being made to limit the coastal recession. Women will see an improvement in their health, and children will have more of an opportunity to grow up in a stable, healthy environment.
The mitigation of climate change is a global issue and not linked to a certain individual country. However, it is up to developed countries to help developing countries as they have more capital, assets, and resources to mitigate climate change globally. Iris Young defines this form of equity as a social connection model of responsibility. Each country has their own individual responsibilities to mitigate the effects of climate change. However, at the same time, it is the shared responsibility of all people to make sure all countries are putting in an equal amount of work as defined by different policies and procedures. The Intriguing game was helpful to explore this future for the Philippines because it provided a simulation of multiple generations fighting over limited capital. The first and second generations used most of the world's capital in this game, only leaving minimal capital for the third generation in the game. This is unacceptable in the eyes of the Philippines for future generations because they do not deserve to live with the mistakes of more developed countries. Because of this, it is important we stress renewable energy resources and living more sustainably to not only our nation, but also globally to other nations. We live on this earth together, so living against climate change is going to be a team effort. The Philippines is consistently at the tail end of other countries. With coastal communities under constant attack from rising sea levels and typhoons, it is clear that the adaptation efforts are much underfunded. Our proposal states that the Philippines should work with the developed countries to obtain funds for the mitigation of climate change. It is everybody's responsibility to ensure the mitigation of climate change, and by receiving funds from developed countries, the Philippines are able to develop more resourceful communities that remain safe and informed about the effects of climate change. Our proposal forces other countries to cooperate with the Philippines to create a sustainable future. The issue of climate change requires collective action, and without the dedication of every single country in the world, we will see much more dramatic effects than we already do today. In the jaws of climate change is proud to have served the Philippines for the last 13 weeks, and we look forward to seeing our policies come to light as the world becomes a better place to live.